Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Asia Society. I'm Josette Sheeran, the President and CEO of the Asia Society, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this very timely and important conversation tonight and global program with participants from around the world. This program is entitled China Has Politics Too: The Impact of Chinese Domestic Politics and Economics on the Future of U.S.-China Relations. Tonight, we'll hear from two very astute and experienced leaders, Kevin Rudd, president of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former Prime Minister of Australia, and Hank Paulson, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and now chairman of the Paulson Institute. This is a very special program for another reason. It will be the last public program I host as president and CEO. It was 6 years ago that I was on the stage at Asia Society with Kevin Rudd and Hank Paulson, also discussing China, just before we launched the Asia Society Policy Institute. Today, ASPI is ranked by the University of Pennsylvania in the top 2% of think tanks in the world and in the United States, and has done a remarkable job of really navigating and helping the world understand U.S.-China relations. I will depart at the end of this year after nearly 8 years leading Asia Society, and Kevin Rudd has been named the next president and CEO of Asia Society. So this is a historic moment for Asia Society and a real pleasure for me now to introduce our program and launch it. Tonight we'll open with Kevin making remarks, and then I'll have a conversation with Hank Paulson and Kevin on the topics that are raised. On the topic of China has politics too. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Josette, and thank you for your encouragement and support for the Asia Society Policy Institute these last 5 or 6 years. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and we wish you all the best for the future. And it's also great to be back with my old pal and buddy, Hank Paulson. We've been partners in crime for many years now, starting with the global financial crisis and through to Hank's continued activism on climate change and our common passion for things Chinese. So it's wonderful to share the stage with both of you today. And I send you greetings from Brisbane in Australia in this crazy COVID world in which we all live. Josette has already introduced my topic, which is China Has Politics Too: the impact of China's domestic politics and China's domestic economic policy settings on the future of US-China relations. For those of you who wish to look at a formal text of these remarks, they'll be up on our website later today. It runs to about 7,500 words. So if you can't sleep tonight, grab a copy of my text and a glass of scotch, and it'll send you off very quickly indeed to sleep. But this will be a quick 20-minute snapshot of what's in those remarks. Two political events dominated the world in the course of October, November this year. One we all know about. It was a certain election in a country called America, which had a certain outcome in terms of the election of Joe Biden and the defeat of Donald Trump. But the second is largely unknown to the international community. Just 5 days before the US presidential election, we had the conclusion of the fifth plenum of the 19th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which laid out China's political and economic blueprint, not just for the next 5 years, but for the next 15. So my overall argument today is that we need to understand much more about the domestic political and economic settings of the Chinese leadership if we are to make sense of China's grand strategy towards the US and the rest of the world, and in turn inform what strategic directions may be undertaken by the incoming Biden administration. A few remarks about 2020 itself from China's perspective, the year that was, our own collective global annus horribilis. Xi Jinping began the year in some difficulty. When the virus broke out, there were question marks raised in Beijing about why their own system of domestic virus and pandemic control had failed. Given that that was set up after the SARS crisis to prevent a repeat of SARS from ever happening again. Secondly, domestic economic growth was already faltering through a curious mix of domestic economic policy settings which had not advantaged the Chinese private sector, and then further compounded by what some in China described as Xi Jinping's overreach with the United States, resulting in the US-China trade war and resulting in the punitive actions by the US administration, in turn impacting on China's economic growth. So it's not an exaggeration to say that by mid-year, Xi Jinping was under some political pressure domestically. But if a week is a long time in politics, let me tell you, my friends, a year is an eternity. Because by the end of 2020, Xi Jinping, in fact, as reflected in the communique of the fifth plenum of the 19th Central Committee at the end of October, early November, had recovered his political position comprehensively. The virus is under control within Beijing itself and within China more broadly, some outbreaks here and there, but response mechanisms in place. Economic growth is recovering. IMF projects between 1.5 and 2% this calendar year. Compare that with the rest of the world. And thirdly, the US-China trade war in a continuing position of stalemate, but all against a background that within China itself, when they apply the lens of China's response to the virus, both in public health and economic terms and political terms, versus the American management of the virus domestically and many other Western countries, it has further consolidated Xi's hold on the Chinese leadership. And so, therefore, when we look at the fifth plenum of the 19th Central Committee, we see a Xi Jinping whose position has been further politically consolidated, that the Chinese economy post-virus is likely to, in fact, accelerate its timetable for becoming a bigger economy measured in GDP at market exchange rate terms in the United States, which is likely to occur sometime in the 2020s. And Taiwan now seems somewhat more in reach. Therefore, the competition with the United States is on in earnest. The Biden administration has been elected. The 2020s looms as a make or break decade for both countries in their strategic competition with each other. This will be very much the decade, in my judgment, of living dangerously, depending on the strategic policy frameworks and policies adopted in Beijing and Washington. A word now about Chinese politics in some greater detail in 2020. The fifth plenum, technically it's an economic document. It's about the party's recommendations for the content of the next 5-year plan in the period 2021 to early 2026. But you know, this plenum was primarily about politics. And that's the way in which it's read in China as a preparatory document for the seminal event, which will be the 20th Party Congress, to be held in just 2 years' time, which will determine whether we have Xi Jinping effectively as leader for life. If you look at the plenum document through a political lens, a number of things emerge. Number one, the new language surrounding the description of Xi Jinping himself. He's now described in the official language as China's core navigator and helmsman. The last time we had a helmsman in China was with Mao Zedong, who was referred to as the Da Duo, the great helmsman. It's not accidental that the term helmsman has come back into use. Number two, most importantly, it is normally this plenum at this point of the Chinese political cycle, that is in the second term of a Chinese leader's incumbency, that a successor is appointed, nominated, or at least indicated. That's what happened with Xi Jinping back in 2010 at the comparable plenum then of the 17th Party Committee. No successor has been indicated or nominated by this plenum. Xi Jinping intends to be sticking around. Thirdly, we have also a continuing purge of Xi Jinping's political opponents. And in case anyone was having any ideas about Xi Jinping's standing earlier this year, Xi Jinping reminded everybody who was on top when even Wang Qishan's former chief of staff, Dong Hong, who'd been with Wang Qishan for some 20 years, was himself arrested. This was to send a warning shot across the bows of everybody in the central leadership, friend, foe, and neutral alike, that Xi Jinping is watching carefully. Four, in June of 2020, the party launched a new party education and rectification campaign. And the head of the Chinese Political and Legal Affairs Commission, Chen Yixin, has said that this is about, quote, pointing the blade inwards to completely remove cancerous tumours, to remove evil members from the group, and to ensure the political and legal team are absolutely loyal. I repeat the word loyal, unquote. Party rectification campaign will be conducted in full, directed at the political and legal apparatus of the party's centre and the provinces throughout the year 2021. Coincidentally, the year leading up to the 20th Party Congress in 2022, which will determine whether Xi Jinping is appointed as leader for life. I think a few other points to mention also on the way through in terms of power consolidation. Xi Jinping over many years now has replaced and been replacing the leadership of the People's Liberation Army, both centrally and regionally. He's brought the People's Armed Police, that is China's paramilitary operation, under party control and no longer state control. He's been in the business of securing promotions to the Central Committee, including at this most recent plenum, of his friends, partners and allies across the country. The new party secretaries being appointed from provinces like Hubei, from Zhejiang, from other provinces as well, the governors of Shanghai and other parts of the country, all of whom are close allies. And a final point in this overall picture is that in this party plenum, we have for the first time a dedicated section in the plenum report pointing to the fifth five-year plan, dedicated explicitly to the question of national security. In fact, the language that is now used on national security is as follows. Security is the premise for all development, quote unquote. And this is about an expansion of the powers of China's security apparatus. And so for those reasons, therefore, we have a significant entrenchment of Xi Jinping's power. What does it mean for the long term? Again, the plenum document has celebrated the success of China realizing its first centenary goal, and that is the elimination of poverty and to achieve a standard of living which is relatively well off for the Chinese people by the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party in 2021. The party was founded in 1921. Tick, that's achieved. The second goal was supposed to be the centenary of the establishment of the People's Republic in 2049, when China would become a fully developed economy. Of course, that remains on the books as the next goal. But most importantly, we now have an intermediate goal of 2035. 15 years from now, where now in this plenum document, we're going to have modernization of the Chinese economy achieved across industry, agriculture, urbanization, and data, where per capita income will, quote, be comparable to that of moderately developed economies, and where China will be in the forefront of global innovation. Why is this important? The 2035 goal is the period of time which Xi Jinping himself is planning to be in office, from now until 2035. That's another 3 terms. Interestingly, Xi Jinping will be a sprightly 82 at that point. That's the age at which Mao Zedong went off to meet Marx back in 1976. Interestingly, it'll be Joe Biden's age at the end of his first term in office. So Xi Jinping would see himself in relative global terms and historical terms as a mere spring chicken. So much for politics. Let me now spend 5 or 7 minutes or so on the economy. Chinese economic recovery in 2020, important, not just in Beijing, but across the world. And at one level, China's recovery figures are impressive. The numbers, the IMF's most recent projections, is that growth in 2020 calendar year will be somewhere between 1.5 and 2%. Given that China is generating positive growth as opposed to negative growth in most of the rest of the world, both developed and developing economies, this is a significant achievement. If you do a drill down, however, most of the economic recovery is still being driven by state investment. It is not yet being driven by full comprehensive private sector recovery. And if you're driving it by state investment, the bottom line is that means that you are further accumulating public debt. And prior to this crisis, Chinese debt to GDP ratio already stood at 310% of GDP. There's a further point about where the Chinese economic policy debate has stood going into this crisis. And that is there has been some stagnation over the last 5 years in China's domestic market-based economic reform program. This was announced as a party blueprint way back in 2013. But after the Chinese domestic financial crisis of 2015, the pace and the intensity and direction of China's market reform program has slowed to a standstill. One exception, the continued reform of Chinese domestic capital markets, and that's been driven by China's need to continue to attract inbound capital for China's medium to long-term future. So what about this plenum? What did it do differently on the economy that we should pay attention to? Two big things stand out. One is it formalized a new China economic development model, which goes by the curious term, quote, the dual circulation economy, the DCE. The dual circulation economy will now enter the vocabulary of all of us trying to understand contemporary developments in the Chinese economy. And in some respects, it represents a replacement concept for 40 years of what was the previous overarching principle of reform and opening. It's the China's new development pattern, to use the Chinese language directly. That's the first significant outcome, and I'll come to its detail in a minute. The second is that China has doubled down in this document of the plenum on state-driven technology policy, high technology policy. So what's this dual circulation economy idea all about? Think of it with three component parts. It's a greater dependence on Chinese domestic rather than external demand to drive future Chinese growth and prosperity. Well, to some extent, that's been around for a while as a Chinese concept, but it's now being accelerated. Second, and a corollary, less dependency on exports as a driver of Chinese domestic growth. And thirdly, and most importantly, to leverage access to China's massive domestic market to global firms in order to secure capital inflow from the rest of the world, and therefore, hence, China's continued liberalization of its own domestic capital markets. These three components we need to bear in mind when we hear the word dual circulation economy. Dual in the sense of domestic demand, external demand, and then thirdly, using the gravitational pull, Xi Jinping's word, not mine, of China's domestic economy to leverage foreign firms to deliver continued inbound capital flow into the Chinese market. So the question arises to why is Xi Jinping doing this? And I think that's an important question for us to understand. In part, it's an acceleration of what Xi Jinping has been discussing now for the last 2 years since the onset of the US-China trade war, which is a greater Chinese doctrine of, quote, national self-reliance. 自力更生. What does it mean? Essentially, it's driven by three things. One, China's growth model, no longer being hostage to the state of the global economy and external demand for Chinese exports and product and services. Two, national self-sufficiency in Chinese technology, given the Huawei experience and China's sense of deep national exposure to the future ability to secure semiconductors into Chinese domestic supply chains. And three, greater national self-reliance in terms of finance and currency. And that is an unfolding script. And that is because China fears in the future, given the strategic deterioration in the US-China relationship, that it, like other countries in the future, will experience the weaponization of the dollar against it, the weaponization of finance against it, and even the possibility medium term of financial sanctions being directed against the Chinese state, not just individuals. And so therefore, it forms part of what Xi Jinping has earlier described in an internal speech last year of preparation for, quote, 30 years of protracted struggle with the United States, unquote. And it's driven, therefore, by a deep sense of Chinese vulnerability on these questions. If you like, therefore, I define the dual circulation economy, or at least its international dimensions, as kind of like globalization, but with Chinese characteristics. Remember the gravitational pull analogy. I said before that the plenum that has just concluded had two major outcomes. The second is what I describe as Xi Jinping's doubling down on a nationally driven high technology policy. It's called now the National Technology Policy, or in the Chinese term is a new type of national system. For those of us familiar with the China 2025 document released back in 2015, which identified 10 high technology categories where China aspired to be both national and global leaders in by 2025, this is not a retreat from that. This is not simply the maintenance of that. This is a doubling down on that. And you'll find that the categories listed within the new national technology policy are more expansive than before, with even a greater list of numerical targets to be realized. This is to be state-driven, driven by state-owned enterprises, and therefore very much a return to, let's call it, the old school of China's economic development policy. A final word on the economy before I conclude, and that is, what about the Chinese private sector? As Liu He and others have reminded us in the past, the Chinese private sector generates 60% of Chinese GDP. It generates the bulk of Chinese taxation receipts. It generates about 90% of all new employment in China and nearly 100% of innovation. So what is the health of the Chinese private sector coming out of all this? I've spoken previously about challenges on this question, namely under Xi Jinping, a greater role for Communist Party secretaries in the operations of private firms. I've spoken previously about the particular application of Chinese domestic credit policy and a predisposition on the part of Chinese state financial institutions to preference SOEs over private firms, large and small. And I've spoken before about Xi Jinping's flirtation with what is called the mixed economy model. That is, mixing equity between private and public firms in the Chinese marketplace. To some extent, we are seeing under Xi Jinping a resuscitation and rebirth of state-owned enterprises. The recent example of the abandonment at party and state direction of the public float of Ant Financial, and whatever story lies behind that, is an important lesson within Chinese domestic economic and business circles, as it is internationally. Why is all this important for the future? It does affect private sector business confidence for the future. Does the business sector, the private sector, continue to believe it has a lot of headroom to move in this new dual circulation economy? Or will they no longer have or not have effective competitive neutrality with Chinese state-owned enterprises, both at home and abroad? And why is that important? It directly impacts China's future growth numbers. I've just reached my 20-minute point, and I will conclude with just one or two sentences more. And very much this plenum, this fifth plenum of the 19th Central Committee, which concluded at the end of October, I think is a turning point in Chinese politics. It's a final confirmation that Xi Jinping intends to be China's leader for the long term, out to 2035. And if I'm a betting man, which all Australians are by birth and predisposition, then I would put my money on Xi Jinping being able, most likely, to achieve that. Second, I also think, though, it's a turning point on elements of economic policy, key elements. Will this mark the final high water mark of, quote, the period of reform and opening? Possibly. Will this new concept of a dual circulation economy and the live idea of national self-reliance within it begin to dominate the period ahead? In my judgment, probably. And what room will that leave for the future growth of the Chinese private sector? I'm uncertain. Either way, these turning points, both in domestic politics and domestic economic policy settings, will of themselves have a profound impact on the future of US-China relations. What could go wrong for Xi Jinping? Well, those of us who've been in politics, the answer to that is anything. There could be a radical polarization of politics in the next 2 years as people fear what will happen to them through the party's internal rectification campaign. Secondly, the Chinese private sector may engage in a private fixed capital investment strike, thereby impacting China's growth levels over time, and therefore undermining the assumptions of the Chinese economy and therefore power of the Chinese state significantly. We could have a system-wide financial crisis that's been predicted for many years and decades now, hasn't materialized yet. There could be a further pandemic. Coronaviruses have a habit of coming back. or there could be an unanticipated, unplanned for, genuine national security crisis or even conflict with the United States. But to conclude in Xi Jinping's own words, as a good Marxist-Leninist, he believes in historical determinism. He believes in historical materialism. He also believes in dialectical materialism. And based on this worldview, he believes that China's time has come, that China continues to be in the ascendant, and that the existing power of the United States is now in decline. So, to conclude, Josette, the ball is now in Joe Biden's court, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kevin. And as always, I feel I have a greater understanding of the important factors driving the U.S.-China relationship and to understand some of the challenges ahead. Secretary Paulson, I'd like to turn to you. You often speak to the leadership in China. You served as Treasury Secretary under President Bush as China was fully emerging onto the global stage in the area of trade. And you had to navigate the politics, not only in the U.S., but also in negotiating with China. So you have a lot of experience on this front. And now we have a new president coming in. As Kevin Rudd said, now over to President Biden to handle this relationship. How do you think the new administration can and will change the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, Josette, thank you. And Kevin, that was a tour de force. And, I agree 100% that you're not going to be very successful in coming up with a policy for dealing with China unless you understand what's going on in China. But to talk briefly about the challenge that President Biden will have, he's inheriting a very fraught, difficult relationship with China. No doubt about it. And, and I think part of this has to do with the policies of the previous administration, but it's largely structural. And, so President Biden is going to come into a presidency where the concerns about China are widespread and they're bipartisan, and where the attitudes of the United States, the citizens of the United States toward China has changed. Many more people see China as a threat whose success has come at America's expense. There's no doubt about that. And I think a lot of the competition is baked into the situation today, and it's structural. When you've got a predominant power, and you've got a rising power that's got a different economic system, a different political system, a different ideology, we're going to have competition. So the challenge for the Biden administration is how to have that competition be healthy, be not pernicious, and keep it from spinning out of control. And as I've said a number of times, the key is going to be to keep that being healthy with competition without unnecessary confrontation, because we've clearly seen that in the past 4 years, confrontation without healthy competition hasn't worked for the United States. It hasn't worked for China. It hasn't worked for the world. And so, clearly, President Biden is going to have a very professional team. So he's got a team of experienced people on the economic side and the foreign policy side. But this is not going to be the Obama presidency and Obama relationship toward China. And so, again, I think you're going to see some administration where there's going to be, the rhetoric won't be as inflammatory, clearly, that the policies will be more predictable, absolutely, and they will, they'll be more comprehensive. But I think and he's going to be dealing with the same challenges that the Trump administration dealt with. And I don't think there's going to be a big difference between how they view the different challenges or threats from China. But I'm very hopeful that you will see a policy that is that makes more sense for the U.S. And I've talked a bit about the Trump policies, which was reciprocity was at the core, right? And it sounds great at 100,000 feet. Treat China the way they've treated us. If they don't open their markets for us, we're not going to open our markets for them. And of course, that it makes sense at 100,000 feet. But when you've got an economy like the United States, which is based upon innovation and openness, competing with a state capitalist, authoritarian capitalist model, it's the danger is we might look more like China. We don't want to do that. So I've argued for something called targeted reciprocity, which is let's do things that make sense for the United States. And I think what you're going to see is, one more word on that. I think often what I've seen the Trump administration do is identify a behavior they don't like, and the remedy ends up hurting the United States more than it hurts China. And so what I'm hoping to see and what I'm expecting to see are policies, in a whole variety of areas. Just take, you asked me about trade, okay? The Trump administration, the phase one trade deal had some very positive aspects to it, but a big part of it was these old style 1990s purchase agreements, which are backward looking. And I'm really hoping and expecting you're going to see a Biden administration focused on areas where the U.S. is strong and industries of the future. We have a competitive advantage, services, and it's financial services would be a very important one, but healthcare, entertainment, focus on those sorts of areas. I think you're going to see, the Biden administration has made it very clear they're going to focus on allies, and that's something that Kevin has talked a lot about. So working with our allies to exert pressure on China. There will be, I think, some, hopefully some bilateral negotiations on trade, focusing on structural changes, opening up the market to be so it's more open to so there's a level playing field in terms of competition, and then there's a lot of room to cooperate in the environmental area. But again, what I'm expecting and what I'm hoping is, although our two countries are going to work closely together on the environment, which they really need to, there's it's in both of our interests and the world's interest. If our two countries don't make progress in dealing with climate change, we're all in deep trouble. But I don't think that China's going to get a free pass on other economic issues because they're cooperating on the environment. I think that's going to be treated like any other economic issue. And, there's all kinds of opportunities for us to work together, but there are things where we need to press the Chinese hard. It makes no sense to have, for instance, tariffs on environmental goods and services. And so that's a huge market in China. And I think there's going to be, concerted pressure on having them open that up. So, Josette, I don't think this is, I think competition is baked into this relationship. And fundamentally, the competition is economic competition. Our economic strength is going to be the core of our diplomatic strength. It's going to be the core of our military strength. And so we are definitely going to compete, and it's going to be a fraught relationship. But to get to the concept that Kevin mentioned, I think he had coined a term. Kevin, what was it? It was constructive competition or whatever. But
I call it either constructive realism or managed competition.
Okay, so constructive realism. And so I think what we really need to do at its core is decide where we are going to compete, where we're going to cooperate, and where there are red lines, and we figure out how to manage the problems that are going to be the most difficult to deal with, and then navigate. There'll be areas where we're going to cooperate, and there's going to be areas where we're going to compete. And of course, the last thing I want to say about the economic relationship and trade is that the core of this competition is technology. No doubt about it. Both countries are competing. Both countries are competing to develop the technology of the future, set the standards, and the technologies that are going to drive global growth in the future. No doubt about that. And there's no way that's going to be negotiated, right? That's going to be decided on the competitive playing field. But the key thing for the United States, and then I get again to this targeted reciprocity. The key thing for the United States is we have to be careful that we sequester the technologies that are essential to our national security. But we need to be pretty careful, because if we go too far and look to decouple to too great an extent, what we're going to do is we're going to just knock our major companies out of being suppliers in the global supply chains to the fastest growing markets around the world. Mm-hmm. We are going to stop participating in global research to the extent we want to. We're not going to be setting the right standards globally. So again, we have to be very, very careful how we handle these issues. And so technology is going to be a huge issue for President Biden and his team to deal with.
Thank you, Hank. Following up on that, Kevin Rudd, I'd like to ask you about targeted reciprocity and how you negotiate that. And in your speech, in your remarks, you were saying it's vital we understand, the world understands the dynamics of the Communist Party politics. And you seem to be saying if we want to move China, we have to understand what drives China in its internal politics in order to move that dial toward a more reciprocal relationship. You were Prime Minister of Australia. You've had to manage this relationship. You've done countless negotiations with China. What advice would you give in a different style or approach, or what does understanding the internal dynamics do to inform the way to approach building more targeted reciprocity or managed competition?
Thank you, Josette. Hank's speech on targeted reciprocity as a framework for handling the US-China relationship, which he delivered at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, I think about a month ago, Hank, is a really good speech. I'd commend it to people's attention. You'll find it on the Paulson Institute website. And if you drill down into it, what Hank's saying is reciprocity as defined in US populist politics is often defined as retaliation and payback to make yourself feel better, even if it produces an economic outcome which takes out a very long rifle and blows your foot off. And that is not smart. What is smart in terms of targeted reciprocity, as Hank argues, is to go to individual elements of the US-China relationship one by one and agree with the Chinese on action matching action. For example, on what the two countries do globally vis-a-vis climate change action and the tariff treatment of goods in this sector and services in this sector, ambitious national targets and ambitious global targets. But secondly, to look at that sort of approach also in areas such as WTO reform, World Trade Organization reform, which is currently in the doghouse. Totally in the doghouse. Unless China and America agree on WTO reform and an effective disputes resolution mechanism, then we can kind of start to kiss goodbye to global free trade. So I agree with, let's call it, a rationally driven targeted reciprocity strategy on the part of the United States. And furthermore, to reinforce again Hank's logic, if you don't and you're just into retaliation mode, you're just into domestic political feel-good mode, then the danger is you begin to transform this massive, open, robust, rambunctious, permanently adapting economy called the United States of America into something which becomes a pale imitation of something else, which is a semi-guided, system. If you want the template for that, Hank just referred to Trump's national purchasing agreements. They don't remind me of the 1990s, Hank. They remind me of Stalin's new economic plan in the 1930s. It's just dumb. It's just not rational economics. But the danger is if you take that logic further, what do? You close down America's borders to this massive influx of global talent, including from China, which has fueled so much of the creativity of Silicon Valley and the rest of the economy, not to mention the young people from India and elsewhere, right across the world. And so America's great strength for the future will be to double down on openness rather than to double down on closeness and become, as it were, progressively like the Chinese system as an act of retaliation against the Chinese system. Now, I have probably not done justice to the elegance of Hank's logic in his speech, but that's why I think it's worth the White House having a think through when the Biden team take over. Final point, Josette, is, I come from this old-fashioned school of international relations, which believes in something quaintly called diplomacy. I know it's an old-fashioned idea, but it's been around for a while. Sometimes it's succeeded, other times it's failed. But, it would be wise, whether it's in Washington or for that matter in Canberra, to get the megaphone and just kind of put it in the top drawer for a while. Just leave it there. Of course, it needs to be reciprocated. Our friends in Beijing need to put their megaphone away, and Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy is monumentally counterproductive for China's own national interests. And the sort of a line, for example, they've adopted in relation to Australia most recently. So putting the megaphone away, returning to classical diplomacy to deal with the outstanding structural challenges in the US-China relationship, some of which are resolvable, others of which are not. I think that's the second element to an overall approach, which our friends in the Biden administration could consider. And finally, it's a very good team that Joe Biden's assembled. I think someone said the other day that Joe Biden, after President George Bush Jr. enters the White House as the most foreign policy experienced US president. And that's reflected in the quality of the team that he's actually brought on board. Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the Director of National Intelligence, as well as, of course, the International Economic Policy team led by Janet Yellen at the Treasury, taking over Hank's old job, the new Secretary of Defense. This is a stellar team. So I think, my view is they've got the cerebral horsepower to wrap their head around the domestic and the international policy challenges which America faces. And my only hope and prayer and my eternal candle to the Blessed Virgin Mary is that American politics makes that possible for this new US administration to deliver on this double-pronged strategy at home, strengthen the US economy, and abroad, a robust strategy together with friends, partners, and allies in working with and the China challenge.
Thanks, Kevin. Hank, I want to follow up on that and go back to your three buckets. Where could China and the US cooperate? Where do they have to compete? And where are the red lines? We often hear of the controversies, and it is less clear, I think, to the American public and to many people around the world, what are the areas that it would be beneficial to cooperate with China? Is there some part of this that could advance and benefit the people in the United States, could advance jobs? So I'd like to ask on the areas of cooperation, where you think there's potential there, perhaps for the Biden administration to try to build momentum on, and then we'll go to the contention and the red lines next.
Okay, well, Josette, just to really come down hard on one thing Kevin said, this is a superb team. I mean, the talent that has come to work with President-elect Biden is amazing. So, and they're all experienced, with China and economic issues. And as Kevin said, the biggest obstacle, other than China, will be politics, right? Because there are plenty of areas where cooperation makes sense, but where politics in one country or the other are going to make it difficult. I remember once in an early conversation I had with President Xi, when he was talking about what it took to navigate the U.S.-China relationship, and that was going back a number of years. He said leaders at the top needed to be able to, there are plenty of areas where there is in the mutual interest, it was in the mutual interest of each country to cooperate, clearly, but it was politically difficult. And it took real political will and strong leadership to cooperate in those areas where it made sense, but where politically it was very difficult. And right now, Biden will be inheriting a very poisonous political situation as it relates to China. Now, in terms of cooperation, there's plenty of areas. Kevin ticked them off. For instance, in terms of the global architecture involving trade, WTO needs to be fixed. And that isn't the U.S. and China. That's the U.S. working with its allies, but China's got to be part of it. And China is, in my judgment, quite willing to compromise and do things in that area. So, and if we don't have rules for trade, and I'm saying trade writ large, looking at technology standards, looking at investment, looking at IP. So I think that's one area. And then when you look at just areas where Xi has said China is going to be open, just looking at, I talked about services, financial services, big time, but not just financial services, healthcare, accounting, there's a whole range of services, entertainment and so on. China, I was looking at some numbers which said China is going to have the biggest consumer economy this year. There's one technology platform that will sell $50 billion of U.S. consumer products into China in 2020. Amazing. So there's a big market there. I think there's a misconception on some people's part that both sides don't now benefit from this economic relationship. It's unbalanced. And I think China needs to do much more. But even today, there's a benefit. And so there are plenty of, and the environment, there are economic opportunities in terms of opening up. Some people have done analysis that show that there's over a 5-year period, there's a $3 trillion market in China for environmental goods and services. And yet they have tariffs. Now, how does it make sense to have tariffs if you're on environmental goods and services? But I think those are areas where it's going to be, some are going to be easier to cooperate. And then the one where it's going to be difficult, but not impossible, is in technology. Because I would say this, Kevin said it better than I did, but the U.S., the innovation engine in the U.S. is going to be hurt if we sequester too much technology. We can't cut ourselves off from the global ecosystem. The rest of the world isn't going to decouple from China. We can't. And so I think that what's going to be so difficult about technology is these technologies of the future are going to really drive, the economic competition with China will, to a large extent, be determined by these technologies. And one of the things China does better than the United States, it doesn't innovate better, but boy, it takes technologies and commercializes them and rolls them out in scale.
How many members of Congress do we have now? 460.
And so I think that's an area, but technology is going to be a very fraught, difficult area. And here the key for the Biden administration is not to shoot ourselves in the foot, not in trying to hurt China, hurt ourselves more. So to have what I would call a high fence in a small yard. And then there's going to be plenty of areas that are going to be more difficult because China has a different economic model. And the last time that Kevin and I were at a meeting with President Xi, he very clearly looked at the group and said, you know what, our system has worked for China. Why do we have to change our system to make ourselves look like other systems around the world? We're going to keep opening up. We believe in globalization, but we want to do it in our terms.
Thank you, Hank. So we have about 10 more minutes. I want to hit a couple of key points. And Kevin, you said in your remarks that how does American democracy and all of its elements deal with the strategic clarity and resolve that is represented by the Communist Party in China and that long-term direction? And you also mentioned that it is likely that Xi Jinping will rule for many years to come. It was once said that in the US, there are 535 hands on the foreign policy steering wheel if you count every member of Congress and every member of the Senate. I want to ask you just how does a leader proceed to get that clarity and resolve, and how much of this can be done and needs to be done leader to leader? Is this a President Biden and a Xi Jinping developing that relationship? Is it a small group like the strategic dialogue with China that Hank Paulson launched a number of years ago when he was Treasury Secretary, that was small and strategic? How do you take that megaphone out of the hands of and the middle of this dialogue and these issues?
Okay, let me shoot through this as quickly as I can, Josette, because time's limited. I think core point is that we in the United States, if I can own America for the purposes of this conversation, but we Western democracies and we other democracies need to have complete self-confidence in our democratic capitalist system. Sure, it's got design faults. I mean, as a former Prime Minister of Australia, I'd give you a bucket load of them. But you know something? As I was saying to Hank in a private conversation yesterday, the great thing about our system of democracies and the electoral process is it contains within it automatic political stabilizers of systems. So that if it leans too far one way or the other, guess what? The electoral process kicks in and you bring about change. Chinese system does not have that. It has a deep rigidity. And in terms of long-term leadership, yes, that has its strengths. Stalin was a long-term leader of the Soviet Union, didn't necessarily bide all that well for the long-term interests of the Soviet Union. So therefore, we should have complete confidence in our democracies and our capitalist systems. Because our capitalist systems, if they're run by open markets, also through the disciplines of domestic price, in a competitive neutrality plus floating exchange rates, there's a bunch of economic stabilizers there which automatically bring our economies back into balance beyond the provision of global public goods, which is also important in our overall setting. So my first point is be confident in our systems. Number two, that does not mean providing a lecture to the Chinese Communist Party day in, day out, that we, the collective West of the United States of America, as Secretary of State Pompeo said recently, should be on about the business of overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party. That's his address to the Nixon Library. I put that in the category of dumb and dumber. As an instrument of US policy, I don't think it's achievable. B, if the Chinese change their political system, it'll be through a series of domestically combusting forces over time, driven out of the economy, out of society, out of let's call it the modernization process. But to have that as a declaratory statement, as a formal instrument of US policy, is self-defeating. So what's the framework? The framework is what I would recommend, Josette, is to return to this concept of managed strategic competition. Easy to say, hard to do. But the 4 bits are know your red lines, and they're not huge in number, but they do exist. Taiwan is classic. Two, understand what questions in the bilateral relationship for the time being are irresolvable and have internal hotlines to deal with the irresolvable ones, plus the red lines. Three, what are the areas of defined strategic competition across foreign policy, human rights and ideology, as well as economic competition and technology? And four, the collaboration points, which Hank elaborated before, to which I'd add global pandemic management. You put those together, and if that conceptually is an agreed framework for working with our Chinese friends, then you have something which doesn't cause each side strategically to be second and third guessing the other because of the complete collapse in mutual trust. And finally, to go to the nub of your question, Joseph, you actually need someone at the center of the Chinese system, the center of the American system, the Chinese equivalent of Jake Sullivan, as he will be as the National Security Advisor, to be the point man or woman within each system to hold these threads together operationally. So that's my best answer to your question.
Thank you. We just have a few more minutes, so I'm going to ask you both the same question. Given the whole range of issues, what do you think is the biggest concern that you have for U.S.-China relations over the next 4 years? And what is the biggest opportunity? If we were just to name one focus of concern or opportunity. And if you'd like to throw in what you would think should be the most important red line on the U.S. side, what would that be? Hank, over to you.
Okay. So the thing that I'm most worried about is that in our effort to constrain China, we'll see the U.S. look to decouple to such an extent that we will hurt ourselves. So I think political pressures, that's my concern. I'm not predicting it, but that's the danger I see. And of course, by far the biggest threat would be if we stumble into war or something. I mean, we've always got to say that that's an issue. And I think I see a number of opportunities, but I see climate change, not just climate diplomacy, but everything that needs to be done economically in terms of building infrastructure to prepare for climate shocks, in terms of rolling out new clean technologies, in terms of working together to technological breakthroughs, to like direct air carbon capture or whatever. I think real opportunities there and opening up markets for U.S. products and services. So I see that the environment as being the biggest opportunity, the environment writ large, the danger of going too far with decoupling is being the most obvious risk. And I still have a concern that this relationship is so fraught, we might stumble into something that would be really bad. But I think that's low probability, but it's what I call a small but deep hole.
Small but deep hole. Kevin Rudd, how would you answer that question?
Well, there's a bit of a unity ticket between Chicago and Brisbane today because my answer is quite similar to Hank's. Biggest concern, a subset of what Hank just said about decoupling gone mad. If you totally decouple, for example, on technology, you will blast a hole in the foot of the US high-tech industry. Take semiconductors, where a huge amount of exports from that industry into the Chinese system produces the profits that American firms need to reinvest in their own next frontier of R&D to remain global leaders. And it's been that way for 20 years, by the way. That's the first thing. There are lines, as Hank says in his targeted reciprocity speech, between core categories of national security and non-core areas where, frankly, we can manage a technology, trade, and investment relationship. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out where the dividing line is. Maybe you do have to be a rocket scientist, but there is a dividing line. Second, on the opportunity, again, I'm with Frank. I'm with Hank. I've been talking to Frank Brown just before this conversation, one of our trustees. Sorry about that, Hank. I agree with Hank on this question, and that is on climate. The collaboration potential is huge. And you know something, if we do it, and we in the Asia Society have been working on this between our Chinese and American friends over the last 12 months, so that we hopefully will have the Biden administration with Xi Jinping's administration hitting the ground running on combined national, bilateral and global efforts on greenhouse gas reductions. It may, if we do it well, it could become psychologically transformative of the way in which both sides think about the relationship overall. In other words, if you have a really good collaborative success on something like saving the planet, guess what? It might actually transform the way in which you think about other stuff as well. Finally, what am I concerned about in terms of red lines? Yeah, the two familiar ones, Taiwan and the South China Sea. Taiwan, I think it's the core element of Chinese high religion in their domestic politics. And therefore, there is a need for a high-level diplomatic clarification of red lines on Taiwan for the future. Privately done, not publicly done, but then adhered to in practice. South China Sea, we need to have a similar set of arrangements so that our freedom of navigation operations in the future and Chinese reactions to them don't trip us into a conflict none of us want. Thank you, Josette.
Thank you, Kevin. And to all of those who joined us, join me in thanking Hank Paulson and Kevin Rudd for bringing insight and clarity to a number of issues. I welcome you to join us at all of our programs. We have done hundreds covering many topics this year. We're going to stay laser focused on this issue of the rise of China, the rise of Asia, and how the world navigates this path in the future. And for me, it's been an honor and pleasure to serve as president and CEO, and I've enjoyed being with you tonight. So thank you, Hank. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josette.